We will begin this exploration of the story of Irish hospitality with a quote from Sylvia Pereira. Quote, "As the old ways trickled down through the millennia, they became secularized. Rites became revels, gods became little people, and sacred wine became booze." End quote. The Irish have a history with rites, rituals, religious customs, and intoxication, from magic mushrooms to golden chalices of the blood of Christ, all the way from the Hill of Tara up to the modern pub and into the treatment centre. As we stand today in Ireland, we have a bar called Sean's Bar, a pub which has been in Ireland, has been running for 1,000 years. And there's another pub in Dublin called the Brazen Head, and that is said to be from the date of around 1198 AD. Sean's pub, however, is said to be from 900 AD. We know from Irish writings going all the way back to pre-Christian times that alcohol and intoxicants, wine, food, indulgence was elevated and expected even, especially at festivities. Moving into more modern times, around the 16th century, we begin to see a change in the Irish people's relationship with alcohol, or the Irish people's relationship with devilment, will you say. Dancing with the spirits, right? So at the Parliament of Drogheda in 1556, a requirement for a license to distill spirits was introduced. In 1759, we have the Guinness Brewery established. We have the Licensing Act of 1902 coming a bit more towards modern times, or contemporary times. And this is from the King of England, and it was for Ireland only, that there shall be no more licenses given. We have the Intoxicating Liquor Act of 1927, where there's limits put on sale, age restrictions, and opening times of venue selling. We have the Intoxicating Liquor Act of 1962. The 1962 Act further adjusted licensing laws, addressing issues such as permitted hours for alcohol sales and conditions under which licenses could be granted or renewed. In 1988, we have the Intoxicating Liquor Act. This legislation raised the legal drinking age to 18 and imposed stricter penalties for serving alcohol to minors. It also introduced measures to combat underage drinking and unauthorised sales. We have the National Alcohol Policy of 1996. And although not a legislative act, this policy document outlined Ireland's strategy to reduce alcohol-related harm through public awareness campaigns, health promotion interventions, and regulatory measures. The Intoxicating Liquor Act of 2003. This act introduced measures to reduce alcohol-related harm, including restrictions on the availability of alcohol, adjustments to licensing hours, and stricter enforcement of laws against serving intoxicated individuals. 2008 gave us the Intoxicating Liquor Act of that year. The 2008 Act further restricted the availability of alcohol by reducing permitted hours for off-licence sales and increasing penalties for offences such as serving underage individuals. And the Public Health Act of 2018. This comprehensive legislation aimed to reduce alcohol consumption and associated harms through measures such as minimum unit pricing, health warning labels on alcohol products, restrictions on advertising and sponsorship, and structural separation of alcohol products in retail settings. So you can see we've had centuries of restriction, red tape. But if we go beyond that, go further back than that, if we go back to Irish mythology and history, we find that the Irish had adopted a totally counter approach to alcohol and indulgence, at least at certain times of the year. At least that is what we've been handed down to us about na bree, right? Before we explore this aspect of earlier Irish life, we must first come some of the way toward understanding the Irish nature, and specifically their elevation of hospitality as the highest social virtue, or at least one of them. To try and soak in this tendency in the Irish, let us hear the story of Diarmid and Goira. I'll be reading this from Seamus McManus's Story of the Irish Race. We begin. The story is told of a certain 7th century king of Connacht, Goira the Hospitable, illustrate the very high regard in which hospitality and generosity were held. Once, being beaten in battle by one of the king's Diarmid, Gaire, in token of submission, had to kneel in front of Diarmid and take in his teeth the point of the victor's sword. When he was in this humiliating position, Diarmid, to test whether his famed generosity was sincere or ostentatious, had first one of the Druids ask of Gaire a gift in honour of learning, to which request the humiliated Gaire paid no heed. And then a leper asked an alms for God's sake, to whom Gaire, with teeth still closed upon the sword point, gave the gold brooch from his mantle. At the secret instigation of the king, one of his people forced the brooch from the leper, who at once complained of his loss to the kneeling one. Gaire immediately unlinked the golden girdle that bound his waist, and reached it to the leper. This gift was instantly also taken from the poor man, when, with sore complaint, the leper came a third time to Gaire, realizing the poor man's distress, and knowing that he had nothing more to give. Gaire's tears ran from his eyes in a stream. "Arise, Gaire," said Diarmid, "and do homage only to God." Diarmid then brought his little foe with him to the great fair of Tailta. As was usual with him, Gaire brought to the gathering a sack of silver to make presents to the men of Ireland. Diarmid, however, had secretly ordered that none should ask or accept a gift from his royal guest. When he had been 2 days at the fair, he sent for a bishop to give him the last rites of the church. Diarmid and his friends, alarmed, asked why he sought the last rites. "Because," answered Gaire, "I have seen the men of Ireland for 2 days assembled together in one spot, without any of them asking me for a bounty. Surely it is the end." Then Diarmid lifted the ban, and Gaire was happy once more. In the presence of the men of Ireland, the peace was ratified between the two kings, who kept it for ever after. If Gaire was generous, his enemy Diarmid was considerate, for when the latter, marching to give battle, was met by a messenger with the request that, as Gaire was not yet fully prepared to give him battle, he should not cross the river for another 24 hours. "I gladly grant his request," said Diarmid, "and would have granted him a much greater had he asked it." Furthermore, Gaire's messenger, having thoroughly viewed Diarmid's army, disparaged it to the king for the smallness of their numbers and the poorness of their appearance, to which Diarmid answered, "Knowest thou not that neither by numbers nor by brave apparel is a battle won, but by the will of God and a truthful cause? And though thou sayest our host is mean to look upon, it is not fair forms but hardy hearts that win a fight." So we have from mythology and Irish story folklore the veneration and the elevation and the prestige that was allocated or given to generosity and hospitality. We will go back now to Seamus McManus's book, and he said, "In the old Irish poets and writers, we find a man reckoned wealthy not by what he has, but by what he gives, and the right hand of the generous man was often said to have grown longer than his left." In the early days, because in many districts people might be too poor or travellers too many for satisfactory private hospitality, there were, at various points throughout the land, public houses of hospitality called breens, and the honoured officials who were entrusted with these houses were called brees, a brewery. A breen was always set at the junction of several roads, frequently the junction of 6. It had open doors facing every road, and a man stationed on each road to make sure that no one passed unentertained. It had a light burning on the lawn all night. A full cauldron was always boiling on the fire. It was stocked with provisions of all kinds in plenty. The esteem in which was held the virtue of hospitality is exemplified by the fact that the public breen was by law permitted the same number of attendants and given the same protection as the king of a territory. His hospice was endowed with land and with other allowances. The breen had a magistrate's jurisdiction for arbitration of agrarian cases. His house, too, was the house of assembly for election of officers of the territory. As the breen was required to welcome at all times every company and every face, his breen must always be stocked with 3 boiled fleshes, 3 red fleshes, and 3 living fleshes. The 3 fleshes were those of an ox, a wether, and a hog. The 3 living fleshes must be at hand, fattened and ready for immediate killing. The 3 red fleshes dressing in the kitchen, the 3 boiled fleshes in the boilers, ready for instant serving. Every breen was required to have at least 100 of each kind of animal grazing in the fields, and 100 servants in the house. He was called a breen cadach, meaning 100 breen. There was a breen letek, 200 breen, who had 200 of each kind of cattle and 100 beds for guests. The good breen was expected to have in his house the 3 miaks, or sacks, a miak of malt to make refreshment for wayfarers, a miak of wheat to give them food, and a miak of salt to improve the food's taste. Also the 3 cheers, the cheer of the strainers straining ale, the cheer of the servitors over the cauldron, and the cheer of the young men over the chessboard, winning games from one another. From the small primer of the Brehon laws we hear, he is no Bruid who is not possessed of hundreds. He warns off no individual of whatever shape. He refuses not any company. He keeps no account against the person, though often he come. Such is the Bruid who has dire with the king of a territory. So we see built into the fabric of Irish society were these public houses to gather people as they travelled, to allow for travel, to allow for pilgrimage style adventures, if you like. And these places were held in such high regard that they had similar protections to a king. The king probably also had to endow and to fund these sorts of places. So it was a case of the top looking after the bottom, something that has been thoroughly lost in Irish life. And by way of comparison, we have from Seamus McManus another anecdote, if you will, or a tale. And that is, quote, "There is a Munster story of a rude, wild mountaineer who visited England 4 or 5 centuries ago, and who, among the many wonderful tales of Saxonland which, on his return, he had to tell, had none more extraordinary, more unbelievable, than that the English people actually charged for the food, liquor and bed, which they provided for a stranger." To add another Irish tale to the mix, we read this from askaboutirland.ie. It says, quote, "Irish people have always been noted for their friendly welcome and hospitality. In ancient times, along the roads of Ireland, there were public houses of hospitality called breens. A breen was always set at the junction of several roads, with a door facing every road. It had a light burning all night, and was always well stocked with food and drink. The breen was by law given the same protection as the king of the territory. One of the most famous of these houses of hospitality was the breen de Derga. The actual site of the Derga's hostel has caused much debate among scholars down through the years. However, Boher na Breen, or na Brún, is the name of a townland on the banks of the Dodder. It means the road of the hostel. Many scholars have thought that it was here that the Derga had his hostel. The destruction of the Derga's hostel has become one of the local myths. During the reign of Conor, peace and prosperity reigned. However, that was soon to come to an end. His foster sons, the sons of Dondessa, formed a robber band that stole pigs and cattle. They did this to see what harm they could do to the king, and what punishment he would mete out to them. They then got Conor's sons to join them. All of them were captured and brought before Conor, who banished them, and they were forced to leave Ireland. While in exile, they met Ingsel, the one-eyed, who was also in exile. Ingsel Kek was the son of the Britons. Ingsel listened with great interest to the foster brothers of Conor Moore when they talked of Ireland, and he saw in that land a great prize of riches. He asked the brothers help him in raiding Ireland. They gathered together an army and landed on the Dublin coast near Howth. At the same time, Conor had gone to the south of Ireland to settle a dispute. On his way back to Tara, he decided to rest for the night. He visited his old friend the Derga at his hostel in Glenismole. The Derga received him with great festivities. The hostel lay so that the Dodder flowed through it. There were several doorways in it, but only one door. This was placed in whichever doorway the wind blew upon the Derga. Ingsel and his followers kept watch on the hostel. They realised that Conor was inside. The hostel was full of warriors, musicians playing and jugglers doing wonderful feats, and the Derga with his servants giving out food and wine. Ingsel then marched to the attack and surrounded the hostel. The great struggle began. The hostel was set on fire, but the fire was put out. Conor and his men sallied forth. Hundreds were killed. Once again the enemy attacked. The hostel was once again set alight. 3 times the hostel was set on fire, and 3 times the flames were put out, using the waters of the Dodder and all the wine in the house. Ingsel asked one of his druids to cast a spell on Conor. The druid makes Conor very thirsty. Conor has done a lot of fighting, but he can fight no more till he gets a drink. He begged for water, but it is all gone, putting out the fire. One of his servants, Macecht, leaves to seek out water for his king. Macecht travelled all over Ireland looking for water, while the battle raged on and Conor was still dying of thirst. At last Machecht finds a lake, Loch Gara in Roscommon, where he fills the king's golden cup. When he returned to the hostel, he found the defenders all dead or fled, and 2 of the attackers cutting off Conor's head. He killed them and poured water into Conor's headless neck. The severed head thanked him for his good deed and then died. The hostel was destroyed. So we have examples of fighting over hospitality, the prestige of hospitality, testing for it, testing for generosity and the ability, the humbleness to give. It will be remembered that in the time of the Tuatha Dé Danann, their king Bray or Brez was deposed because he lacked the first essential, hospitality. Brez, as is said, did not grease their knives to visitors. In vain they came to visit Brez. Their breath did not smell of the ale of the banquet. A poet then put a satire on Brez, mocking him, ridiculing him for his greed. Brez was dethroned. Or what we have lost in Ireland, what we have lost in practice, our moral centres have not allowed to vanish, for we still assume that those in power retain the duty of giving and sharing and caring for those below their tribal role. We've simply lost the connection up and down the chain of command. Our priests became corrupted, our elders and spokespeople took the coin, our kings were downgraded to politicians, and we all lost our way, clinging perhaps to a romantic memory that all power is duly earned.